They looked like the kind of family you'd wave to every morning, the kind that hosted barbecues on weekends and sent out Christmas cards on time. The Hargroves were, by every definition, ordinary. Daniel Hargrove worked the night shift at the local steel factory. He was quiet, punctual, and polite, the kind of man who kept his head down and his yard trimmed. His wife, Claire, was the heart of the neighborhood, leading a small book club, baking for church fundraisers, and volunteering at the local library. Their children, Emily and Joshua, attended Sunday school every week. They were bright, well-behaved, and always walked to school hand in hand. For a small town like Maple Hollow, people like the Hargroves represented stability, the image of a wholesome American family. But sometimes, the quietest streets hide the loudest secrets. Cut to footage, an aerial shot of a sleepy neighborhood at dusk. The lights go out, one by one. Narrator, V.O. Neighbors would later say nothing ever seemed off, until it was too late. But looking back, they all remember something. Something small. Something they brushed off. Mrs. Latham, who lived 2 houses down, recalled waking up some nights to faint humming, rhythmic, low, and impossible to place. She thought it was the wind, or maybe the TV left on somewhere. Others spoke about strange smells drifting from the Hargroves' backyard, smoke mixed with something metallic. And then there was the basement. No one had ever been inside it. Not even their closest friends. When asked, Daniel would laugh it off, say it was just storage space. But when delivery men once offered to carry down a heavy box, he refused. "Leave it by the door," he'd said. "I'll handle it." Music fades darker, the sound of distant thunder. Narrator, V.O. On the surface, their life was untouched by tragedy. But beneath it, something was shifting. It began with the pets. 3 families reported missing cats that summer. Another family's dog was found dead near the woods, no signs of struggle, just placed there. Like someone had returned it. Then there were the lights, flickering candlelight, faint and slow, seen through the Hargroves' basement window late at night. Neighbors assumed they were praying. Others didn't ask. Because in towns like Maple Hollow, people don't ask questions. Brief pause. Slow piano resumes. In old photos, the Hargroves look happy, frozen smiles, sunlit picnics, matching clothes. But if you look closer, you can see something else, Claire's hand gripping Daniel's arm too tightly. Daniel's eyes never quite meeting the camera. The children smiling, but only with their mouths. Narrator, V.O. Behind every perfect picture, there's a story. And sometimes, that story was never meant to be told. The police would later learn that the Hargroves had moved to Maple Hollow under strange circumstances. They'd left their previous home abruptly, sold everything in less than 2 weeks. No forwarding address, no family visits, no online presence. It was as if they wanted to disappear, but hadn't quite managed to. And then, one evening, something changed. A new neighbor, Brian Keller, had just moved in next door. That night, he stepped out to take the trash when he heard it, a sound like chanting, echoing faintly through the trees. At first, he thought it was the radio. But when he turned, he saw it, a dim orange glow from the Hargrove basement window. He would later describe it as a flicker that didn't behave like fire, like it was pulsing. He stood there, frozen, until the chanting stopped. Then, just silence. And the next morning, the Hargroves greeted him like nothing had happened, smiling, polite, asking about his move. Music halts, single piano note lingers. Narrator, V.O. To everyone else, they were still the perfect family next door. But for Brian Keller, something had changed. He started locking his doors twice. Keeping his curtains drawn. And every night, when the wind blew just right, he swore he could still hear that hum, soft and rhythmic, coming from the house next door. Beat of silence. Low drone fades in. No one knew it yet, but within just a few months, that house would become the center of one of the most disturbing disappearances Maple Hollow had ever seen. Soft thunder roll. Fade to black. Narrator, whisper, how well do we really know the people who live beside us? Cut to black screen, faint echo of chanting carries over. It started like any other night. The rain was heavy, but not unusual for late October. Streetlights flickered under the weight of the storm, and the town of Maple Hollow seemed wrapped in a blanket of quiet. Inside their homes, families were winding down, TVs murmuring, children asleep, the world still safe. But at 9:47 p.m., that silence shattered. A single scream, sharp, high, and human, tore through the calm. Sound design, faint echo of a woman's scream. Static hum beneath it. It came from 184 Hollow Creek Road, the Hargrove house. Neighbors called 911 within minutes. One described it as, a sound you don't forget, the kind that rips through your spine. Another said it was followed by something else, a low humming, like voices overlapping in rhythm, swallowed by the storm. When officers arrived, the street was empty. No lights, no movement. Just the sound of rain dripping from the eaves and the faint buzz of a porch light. Rain ambience fades to interior soundscape, footsteps, flashlight clicks. Narrator, the front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked painfully ordinary, dinner plates half finished on the table, the TV playing a nature documentary, and a board game frozen mid-play. But there was no one there. No Daniel. No Claire. No Emily. No Joshua. Only silence. Detective Laura Whitman was called in within the hour. A veteran investigator with 20 years on the force, calm, analytical, and haunted by a past case she never solved. She described walking into the Hargrove house as entering a photograph, a perfect picture missing its people. Every detail suggested they had just vanished midlife. Dinner was still warm. A chair was tipped over. The family car sat in the driveway, keys still in the ignition. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. Sound, distant thunder. Soft reverb of footsteps. And then, they reached the basement. The door was locked from the outside. Officer Jenkins forced it open, splintering the frame. The air that poured out was heavy, thick, humid, and carrying a faint metallic odor. The smell of something old. Music drops into low drones. Whitman led the way down. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing shapes carved into the wood. Symbols. Circles. Words in Latin. Candles, dozens of them, had melted into thick rivers of wax that fused with the concrete floor. In the center stood a wooden table, scorched and blackened. On it lay a series of objects, an empty chalice, several rusted knives, and something that looked like a lock of hair wrapped in cloth. But it was what they found on the floor that stopped everyone cold. An outline, faint but visible, drawn in what appeared to be dried blood. Within the outline, residue of ash and candle soot formed the shape of a human body. Forensic technicians took samples, but the results wouldn't return for weeks. What mattered that night was what they could see. The Hargroves hadn't been robbed. They hadn't fled. Something had happened right here, something ritualistic. Beat of silence. Whitman found a small, folded piece of paper on the altar. The ink had bled from the moisture, but a single sentence could still be read, "The offering must be made, or he will come for us all." Pause. Soft metallic hum rises. Police combed the entire house, room by room. The children's beds were neatly made. A single doll sat upright on Emily's pillow, its eyes painted shut with black ink. In Joshua's room, Whitman found drawings, stick figures surrounding a large shadow shape. Each figure had something written beneath it: Mom. Dad. Me. Him. Music tightens. Static buzz creeps in. At 12:16 a.m., officers officially declared the Hargroves missing. But Whitman refused to leave the scene. She felt something was wrong, not just with what she saw, but what she didn't see. There were no family photos in the entire house newer than 6 months old. No school papers. No recent mail. No calendar marks. As if, sometime in the past half-year, the Hargroves had slowly erased themselves from time. And then came the sound. Low, almost inaudible hum begins, rhythmic, human-like. It came from beneath the floorboards. At first, faint, like distant wind. Then stronger, like whispers colliding under the house. Officers froze. Flashlights swung. The sound stopped. When they lifted one of the floor panels, they found nothing but solid concrete. No crawlspace. No wires. No pipes. Just cold stone. Whitman later wrote in her report, "It wasn't the absence of evidence that unsettled me. It was the feeling that something was watching us from below." The search had yielded no answers. The home was sealed off as a potential crime scene. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, holding umbrellas, whispering theories. One officer recalled seeing a man standing near the tree line, tall, motionless, barely visible in the storm. When the lightning flashed, he was gone. Sound, thunderclap. Music swells. Narrator, V.O. The official report described the event as a family disappearance under unusual circumstances. But Whitman couldn't shake the image of that basement, the symbols, the melted candles, the phrase carved into the wood above the altar. For purity, through offering. She didn't know it then, but that phrase would appear again. On another case file. From another town. Almost 30 years earlier. Music cuts to silence. One soft piano note echoes. And before the night was over, Whitman found one final thing, lying neatly on the altar, untouched by the storm. A small, white child's shoe, placed carefully at the center of the ritual circle. The town of Brindle Hollow, at first glance, looked like a place frozen in time, cobblestone streets, flickering gas lamps, and the faint chime of the church bell marking each passing hour. Every window had lace curtains, every porch had a rocking chair, and every soul, it seemed, knew everyone else's business. But beneath that illusion of harmony lay a quiet unease, a silence that wasn't peaceful, but protective. Because in Brindle Hollow, some things were better left unseen. The Harlans had lived on the outskirts for nearly 3 generations, their property tucked behind a thicket of pine trees that seemed to grow denser with each passing year. The family didn't attend church, didn't host barbecues, and rarely joined the town's seasonal fairs. And while gossip was the lifeblood of Brindle Hollow, the Harlans were the one topic that made even the boldest whisperer stop mid-sentence. Some said it was because of what happened to old Mrs. Harlan, how she was found one autumn morning in her garden, eyes open, mouth filled with dirt, as if the earth itself had claimed her. Others claimed the family had roots that reached too deep, a local euphemism for secrets that predated memory. Whatever the truth, the townsfolk agreed on one unspoken rule: you don't go near the Harlan property after dark. But the odd thing about Brindle Hollow was that everyone knew something, or thought they did. The butcher swore he saw strange lights from the Harlan woods on stormy nights. The schoolteacher once heard chanting, faint but rhythmic, echoing from the direction of their farm. And the postman, the only one brave enough to go near their gate, said the family had a peculiar way of looking at him, as if sizing him up for something he couldn't name. Still, when asked directly, the townspeople would shrug and mutter, "It's none of our business." Because in Brindle Hollow, curiosity was dangerous. Those who poked too hard often found themselves on the wrong end of bad luck. A failed harvest. A burned barn. A sick child. So, people learned to look the other way, to act as though nothing unusual ever happened on the edge of town. It was easier that way. Safer. Every small town has its secrets, but Brindle Hollow's secret was different. It wasn't just a rumor or an unsolved crime, it was a presence, something that moved through the town like fog. Children felt it first. They said they dreamed of figures standing in the woods, watching from the shadows. Parents dismissed it as imagination, though they secretly checked their locks twice before bed. And every once in a while, a dog would go missing, a deer carcass would be found near the Harlan fence, its blood drained, and whispers would flare again, whispers about old rituals, the kind their grandparents spoke of in hushed tones. Still, no one dared accuse the Harlans. The family's patriarch, Leonard Harlan, was quiet but commanding. He'd run the lumber mill for decades and paid his taxes early. When the mayor's house burned down, Leonard was among the first to offer help, lending men, timber, and money without hesitation. He was respected, even liked in a distant way. And perhaps that's what made everything more unsettling. How could someone so generous, so practical, also inspire so much fear? By day, the Harlan children attended school like any others. By night, their windows glowed faintly, not from candles or lamps, but from something else. Something colder. Some claimed they practiced old rites, rituals meant to keep the land alive. Others believed they were protecting the town from something older, darker, buried beneath Brindle Hollow itself. Whatever it was, the family's isolation only deepened as the years passed. There was one person, though, who refused to accept the silence, Margaret Dean, the town's new librarian. She had arrived 2 years earlier, full of optimism and curiosity. To her, the Harlans weren't monsters or mystics, just misunderstood neighbors wrapped in superstition. Every town needs its ghost story, she'd say with a soft laugh. But her laughter faded the day she decided to visit their property. On a cloudy afternoon in late October, Margaret drove out past the old mill road, where the asphalt turned to gravel and the forest seemed to swallow the light. She intended only to drop off a box of donated books, a gesture of goodwill. But when she reached the Harlan gate, tall, wrought iron, covered in creeping ivy, she hesitated. The air felt wrong, thick and humming, as though charged by static. Still, she pressed the bell. No one answered. After a minute, she turned to leave, and that's when she noticed the carvings on the gatepost. Symbols. Circles within circles. Lines intersecting in patterns that seemed both geometric and organic, like veins on a leaf, or cracks in ancient stone. She took a photo with her phone, telling herself it was just folk art. But that night, as she studied the image, she realized the symbols weren't decorative at all. They matched diagrams she'd once seen in an old folklore compendium, marks associated with boundary wards, used to contain something within, not keep others out. The next day, Margaret returned to the library pale and silent. She avoided questions, brushed off her colleagues' concern, and worked late into the night. Over the next few weeks, she seemed to fade, sleep-deprived, distracted, always glancing toward the window at dusk. Then, one morning, her car was found parked near the river. Her bag, phone, and coat were still inside. Margaret Dean was never seen again. The town's reaction was swift and predictable, they didn't react at all. The sheriff called it a voluntary disappearance, and the mayor discouraged rumors. The townsfolk returned to their routines, though the library door remained locked for weeks. In whispers, they said Margaret had gone where she wasn't supposed to. And when the autumn fog rolled in thick that year, some swore they saw a light moving between the trees, faint, white, flickering, like a lantern held by unseen hands. Brindle Hollow, once again, chose silence. But silence, like rot, spreads. And deep beneath the pine roots that marked the Harlan land, something old had started to stir, something that had been waiting for someone curious enough to listen. When winter settled over Brindle Hollow, it did so like a shroud, the kind of cold that silences even the crows. The Harlan property looked almost picturesque under the frost, its roofline softened by snow, smoke curling from the chimney. But those who passed by claimed the smoke smelled strange, not of burning wood, but of something bitter, metallic, and ancient. Inside the Harlan home, the family's nightly gatherings grew longer. Through frosted windows, faint candlelight flickered against the walls, accompanied by low murmurs that rose and fell in a cadence no one recognized. Leonard Harlan had begun spending hours in the basement, sometimes emerging near dawn with soot on his hands and a strange calm in his eyes. The townspeople whispered again, but only in private. And still, no one dared confront him. It wasn't until the thaw began that anyone saw what had been buried all winter. In early March, a group of surveyors arrived in Brindle Hollow. They'd been hired to assess land parcels for a new development near the southern edge of the Harlan Woods. One morning, their equipment picked up an unusual hollow beneath the soil, an underground chamber or sinkhole. Thinking it an old root cellar, they began to dig. Within hours, they struck something hard. Stone. Carved. Covered in markings that no one could decipher. The sheriff was called in, though reluctantly. He brought Leonard Harlan to the site, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps out of fear. Leonard stood over the half-exposed slab for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing," he finally said. "An old storm shelter. My father built it." But his voice wavered on the last word. That night, the surveyors packed up their gear and left town. No explanation. No payment collected. Just gone. What they had unearthed, it turned out, wasn't a shelter at all. Beneath that stone lay a circular pit lined with symbols, the same ones Margaret Dean had photographed on the gatepost months before she vanished. At its center was a wooden altar, stained dark by something that wasn't just age. Locals who had glimpsed it swore they felt the air hum, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. By dawn, Leonard had sealed the pit again. He poured cement over the slab and covered it with soil, erasing every trace. When questioned by the sheriff, he simply said, "Some things are better left untouched." But the ground around the Harlan home never froze again. Even in the deepest frost, a thin mist lingered near the property's edge, drifting like breath from the earth. The youngest Harlan, Clara, began waking up screaming at night. Her older brother Samuel claimed she spoke in her sleep, in a language no one recognized. Once, their mother found her standing barefoot in the backyard, eyes open, muttering softly while her feet bled from the frozen ground. Leonard forbade anyone from mentioning it again. What the family didn't know was that someone had seen. Eli Parsons, a retired mill worker, lived across the creek from the Harlans. He had worked with Leonard's father decades earlier and was one of the few who still remembered the stories, about how the elder Harlan had brought something back from his time in the war. Artifacts, they said. Things that should have stayed buried. Eli had always dismissed it as superstition. But that winter, he started keeping a journal. He wrote of figures seen near the tree line, not shadows, but silhouettes of people walking in circles. Of hearing music at night, faint and low, like humming through the soil. He described a light rising from the ground, as though the forest itself were breathing fire. His last entry read, "They are opening it again." 3 days later, Eli's cabin burned to the ground. The fire department ruled it an accident caused by a faulty stove. The journal was never recovered. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen in town. Livestock turned up mutilated, their bodies arranged in perfect circles. The church bell rang at odd hours, even when no one was inside. The pastor found salt scattered at the entrance each morning, as though someone was trying to ward off something invisible. For the first time, people began to whisper not just about the Harlans but about what they might be protecting. "Maybe it isn't them," some said. "Maybe they're keeping something worse from getting out." Others believed the opposite, that the Harlans had become vessels for something inhuman. Whatever the truth, one night in late March, everything came to a head. A storm rolled in, thunder without lightning, rain without wind. From miles away, townsfolk saw a crimson glow flicker through the Harlan woods. The sheriff drove out alone, against every warning. He radioed dispatch once, "There's movement out here. Lights everywhere. Tell the mayor," the transmission cut off. When morning came, the Harlan property was silent. Smoke rose from the trees, though nothing had burned. The sheriff's cruiser was found at the edge of the creek, door open, engine still running. Inside was his hat, and on the passenger seat, a piece of parchment, brittle, stained, and marked with the same circular symbol found on the stone pit. For days, volunteers searched the woods, but no trace of the sheriff or the Harlans was found. Only the faint smell of ash lingered, carried by the wind. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the mayor's office, no return address, no postage mark. Inside was a single line written in uneven ink, "The roots are awake. The circle is not closed." The town tried to move on. Spring came, flowers bloomed, and Brindle Hollow pretended, once again, that nothing had happened. The mayor ordered the Harlan land condemned and fenced off. Children were told stories, that the Harlans had moved away, that the sheriff had retired. But at night, when the wind shifted, people still heard the faint rhythm of drums coming from the woods. And deep beneath that soil, beneath the sealed pit and the burned-out foundations, something pulsed. Not alive, not dead, but waiting. Waiting for another voice to speak the words that would wake it again. The town didn't know it yet, but the ritual was never meant to end. It was meant to continue, through time, through blood, through every silent generation that chose not to see. And in Brindle Hollow, silence was tradition. Spring should have brought relief to Brindle Hollow. The frost had melted, the trees had begun to bloom, and the air once again carried the sound of birds instead of howling wind. But beneath the sunlight, something in the town had changed. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, neighbors who once greeted each other in passing now crossed the street in silence, and the laughter of children had become rare, almost unnatural, as though they too sensed something pressing against the fragile calm. The Harlan disappearance had never been declared an investigation. There were no missing person posters, no search parties after the first week. The official story was simple: the family left. Moved away without notice. But those who'd lived in Brindle Hollow long enough knew better. The woods around their property had grown darker, thicker. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter, whining and clawing at the ground as if it burned. Then came the dreams. It began with the oldest residents, men and women who'd been born in Brindle Hollow and planned to die there. They spoke of the same nightmare, standing in the woods, barefoot, surrounded by fog, hearing their own names whispered by unseen voices. Some woke with scratches on their arms, or with dirt beneath their fingernails. The local doctor dismissed it as stress, a shared trauma response to the missing family. But no one could explain why those dreams always occurred on the same nights, the nights when the moon disappeared completely. By late April, it wasn't just dreams. A farmhand named Owen found something in the creek near the old Harlan fence, a small wooden figure, crudely carved, wrapped in fabric and bound with twine. It looked almost human, but wrong, its proportions were off, its head too large, its arms etched with strange symbols. When Owen tried to show it to others, the figure broke in half, hollow inside. Packed within the cavity was a clump of what looked like human hair. Word spread fast, though most denied hearing it. The next day, Owen didn't show up for work. His employer found his boots by the creek, one lying upright, the other half buried in mud. The current was too weak to have carried him off, yet no trace of him was ever found. The sheriff's office, now run by Deputy Claire Rowe, reopened the Harlan file, though unofficially. Claire had been the sheriff's protégé, young and methodical, but ever since his disappearance, she developed an obsession with the case. She began interviewing residents quietly, late at night, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Did you ever hear chanting? Did you ever see light near their home? Did they ever give you anything, food, gifts, tokens? Most denied it. But a few, older ones, confessed to something more chilling. They remembered Leonard Harlan's father, long before Leonard was born. How he'd arrived in Brindle Hollow after the war with crates of artifacts he claimed came from Eastern Europe, stone tablets, scrolls, relics covered in a language no one could read. How he'd built his home not over existing land, but over an old foundation that had been there long before the town existed. Claire found those accounts intriguing, but what disturbed her most was a name that appeared repeatedly in the testimonies, the root keeper. It wasn't a person, not exactly. Some described it as a spirit, others as a force, something bound to the Harlan family, passed down through generations like an inheritance. Its purpose, they said, was to protect the town by feeding on something else, an ancient hunger that couldn't be destroyed, only contained. But if the Harlans were gone, who was containing it now? Claire began spending nights at the old library, digging through Margaret Dean's archives. She found the librarian's handwritten notes, margins filled with frantic scrawls, "It's not protection, it's exchange." Another line, almost illegible, read, "They keep it sleeping, but it dreams." Those words burrowed into Claire's mind. She started dreaming too. The same woods. The same fog. And always, at the center, the faint sound of drums, not loud, but deep, like a heartbeat in the earth. Her breaking point came one night when she returned home to find soil on her doorstep. Not a pile, but a thin trail leading to her door, ending in a perfect circle. Inside the circle lay a folded piece of paper. When she opened it, she found the same symbol from the sheriff's car, the intersecting circles. And beneath it, in red ink, the words, "You opened it when you asked." That night, Claire packed her files, her recorder, and her gun, and drove toward the Harlan property. The fence was still there, rusted but intact. Beyond it, the house stood silent under a half-moon, windows like black eyes watching her approach. She felt the air shift, colder, denser, the same static Margaret had described months before. She stepped inside. The house was untouched, dust thick on the furniture, family photos still on the walls. In one, Leonard stood beside his wife and children, smiling stiffly. But behind them, reflected faintly in the window, was a shape, tall, shadowed, with what looked like branching antlers rising from its head. Claire blinked, looked again, but the reflection was gone. Downstairs, she found the door to the basement padlocked. She shot it open. The air that spilled out was damp and cold, carrying the smell of earth and iron. A staircase descended into darkness. Her flashlight flickered. On the walls, she saw symbols, hundreds of them, carved into the stone, glowing faintly as if reacting to her presence. At the bottom, the floor opened into a chamber. It was circular, wide, and lined with stones blackened by soot. In the center was an altar, the same one buried in the pit outside, only this one was freshly used. On it lay a single object, a child's shoe. Clara's. Then came the sound. Faint, rhythmic, like something moving in the soil beneath her feet. Thump. Pause. Thump. Louder each time, as if climbing upward. Claire froze, light trembling in her hand. She whispered into her recorder, voice shaking, "I think I found where the tape cut out." When her patrol car was found 2 days later, it was empty. Inside the trunk were her notes, her badge, and a journal filled with the same drawings from Eli Parsons's lost notebook. Her final entry read, "It's not under us. It's inside us." After that, no one dared enter the Harlan woods again. The mayor fenced the area completely, declaring it private property. The few who lived nearby began reporting strange vibrations in their walls, lights flickering at exactly midnight, and dreams that left them waking with soil under their nails. Brindle Hollow continued on, pretending, as it always had, that nothing was wrong. But the silence had changed tone. It was no longer fear. It was waiting. Because the circle wasn't broken. It had just shifted. And somewhere beneath the thawing ground, the heartbeat continued. By summer, Brindle Hollow had begun to rot from the inside out. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity and the scent of decay. Gardens withered. Crops failed. Birds abandoned their nests, and the sound of insects, once constant, vanished entirely. The people called it a bad season, but deep down, everyone knew it was something else. Something they couldn't name. Something the earth itself seemed to be whispering about. Those who lived nearest to the old Harlan property began to hear it first, a low hum that rose from the ground late at night. It wasn't mechanical, not electrical. It was deeper, almost alive. Some said it sounded like chanting beneath the soil, others claimed it was the wind caught in the hollow roots. But there was no wind. The air was still, the trees unmoving, yet the hum persisted, rhythmic, patient, unrelenting. The children started to dig. No one told them to. They simply began doing it. In backyards, in schoolyards, even along the riverbank, small holes, scattered and shallow, as if their little hands were searching for something buried. When parents asked why, they'd all give the same answer: the voice told me there's something underneath. The local pastor tried to intervene. He called it a spiritual infection, the lingering residue of the Harlan curse. During Sunday sermons, he urged the townsfolk to pray, to cleanse the soil and their hearts. But even he could not deny what he felt during those nights, the subtle vibration through the floorboards, as though the church itself were trembling in fear. One morning, he found the church door wide open. The altar had been moved, the candles rearranged into a circle, wax dripping onto a symbol etched into the wooden floor. No one confessed to doing it. But every person who attended that service swore they felt the ground shift beneath them when the pastor spoke the Lord's Prayer, a slow, pulsing movement, like the earth breathing. It was then that the town began to fracture. Half believed they were cursed. The other half believed they were chosen. Rumors spread that the Harlans hadn't vanished at all, that they'd simply returned to the roots, as the old phrase went. Some townsfolk started leaving offerings at the forest's edge, bread, coins, small trinkets, in exchange for peace. For a while, it worked. The hum faded. The nightmares lessened. Until one night, the earth groaned again. That same night, a sinkhole opened near the old mill road, wide enough to swallow a truck. When rescuers arrived, they found no signs of collapse or structural weakness. Just perfect smoothness, as if the soil had been scooped out from below. At the bottom of the hole lay bones. Hundreds of them. Not animal, human. Some ancient, some fresh. The discovery should have drawn reporters, state police, scientists. But the mayor ordered it sealed before word could spread. "We'll handle our own," he said. The next morning, the sinkhole was filled, the area fenced, and the town carried on. But those who had seen the bones, the men who worked through the night, began to change. They grew pale, sleepless. Their eyes darkened with deep bruises that no rest could cure. They spoke less, avoided light, and were often found standing motionless in their yards at dawn, staring toward the woods. One of them, a man named Callum Briggs, was heard muttering over and over, "It remembers us. It remembers everything." 3 days later, Callum drowned in the creek. His lungs were filled with dirt, not water. It was around this time that the town historian, Agnes Morton, began piecing together something no one else wanted to see. She uncovered records dating back to Brindle Hollow's founding, deeds, maps, and journals belonging to the first settlers. Buried among them was a warning written in faded ink: "We built here not upon land, but upon what sleeps beneath it. The roots run deep and demand their due." Agnes traced the town's map over the old records and realized something horrifying: every major landmark in Brindle Hollow, from the church to the mill to the Harlan property, aligned perfectly with a circular pattern. A ritual seal, centuries old. The town itself was part of the ritual, its roads, its rivers, its boundaries forming a containment sigil. The Harlan family hadn't created it. They'd been maintaining it. When Agnes tried to show her findings to the mayor, he dismissed her with a forced smile. "Let old ghosts lie," he said. The next morning, Agnes's office burned down. No accelerants, no signs of forced entry. Just ash, and in the middle of her desk, a single symbol drawn in soot, the circle intersected by a vertical line. After that, Brindle Hollow began to fall apart. Pets vanished. Wells turned brackish. The hum grew louder, no longer faint, but audible even through closed windows. People began hearing their names whispered when they were alone, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. The soil itself seemed to shift underfoot, soft and restless, like something moving just below the surface. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint, like radio static. Then clearer. Familiar. Lost loved ones calling out from beneath the ground. Husbands heard their wives, mothers heard their children, voices that sounded real, desperate, pleading. Some followed those voices into the woods. None came back. By July, no one in Brindle Hollow slept. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut, but it didn't matter. The hum was inside now. In the walls, in the pipes, in the heartbeat of the town itself. And through it all, the earth waited. Because what the Harlans had bound wasn't gone. It had only been dreaming. And as the town's silence deepened, the echoes beneath the soil grew louder, voices calling for release, for remembrance, for continuation. The circle was breaking. The roots were awake. And this time, there was no one left to hold them down. By late summer, Brindle Hollow had become a place no one recognized. The streets were empty at night, the once bustling market silent. Gardens had turned brown, fruit rotting on the ground, and the river that ran through town seemed sluggish, almost viscous. The smell of damp earth and decay hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. Every house held the same quiet dread, a low vibration that residents could feel through the floors, through their bones, through the very air. The town's remaining adults tried to cling to routine, though routine was no longer enough. They avoided the woods at all costs. They barred their windows and locked their doors. But the hum beneath the ground had grown louder, and now, occasionally, a tremor would ripple through the streets, faint, like the heartbeat of something massive sleeping just beneath. Children were disappearing. It began with faint rumors. A pair of twins vanished while playing near the riverbank, leaving only tiny footprints that ended abruptly at the water's edge. Then a teenager named Elsie walked into the woods one evening to collect firewood and never returned. Her mother, frantic, searched all night and found only a single strand of her hair, wrapped around a stone. No tracks led to or from it. Those who remained spoke less and less. Words felt dangerous. A whispered question about the missing was enough to draw cold eyes from neighbors. The town had become a cage of silence. Deputy Claire Rowe, still obsessed with the Harlan disappearance, returned to the town after hearing about the vanishings. She was different now, gaunt, sleep-deprived, haunted by the visions of the basement and the pit. She brought with her journals, maps, and photographs she had collected from old town archives, piecing together the centuries-old cycle of disappearances. Her theory was chilling: the earth beneath Brindle Hollow had been feeding, slowly, across generations. Every few decades it demanded a reckoning, an offering of flesh, willingly or not, to maintain the unnatural balance that the Harlan family had once contained. Without the Harlan lineage to continue the ritual, the soil had begun taking what it was owed directly. Claire spent nights wandering the town, recording anomalies. Floors that trembled without cause, walls that hummed with low-frequency vibrations, lights that flickered in patterns resembling ritual symbols. She charted the disappearances, mapping the locations of the sinkholes, the sites of strange phenomena, the places where children vanished. Every line led back to the Harlan property, the epicenter of the disturbance. One evening, Claire followed the vibrations into the edge of the forest. She walked slowly, flashlights in hand, careful not to disturb the ground. The hum grew louder with each step, more insistent. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees, and she could swear shapes moved just beyond the light. She stumbled upon a pit, partially covered by roots and moss. It was wide, circular, and lined with stones carved with symbols identical to those in the Harlan basement. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through her chest. She shone her flashlight down, and at the bottom, she saw them, small human figures, motionless, bound with vines and clay, arranged in patterns resembling constellations. Claire recoiled, falling backward, heart pounding. But the figures shifted. Their heads lifted, slow, deliberate. Eyes opened, pale and empty, staring upward. They were alive, but not fully. Their bodies were half subsumed by the soil, moving in tandem with the pulse beneath. The earth was feeding. Panic surged through Claire. She scrambled back, tripping over roots, nearly falling into the pit. When she reached the edge, she looked down once more. One figure, a child she recognized from missing persons reports, raised its hand. Not toward her, but toward the forest. And then the soil rippled, the roots twisting, and the figure disappeared beneath the ground entirely. From behind her, a sound, a low, wet thud, like soil being moved rapidly. Claire turned and saw the ground along the edge of the pit shift, forming a shape that resembled a human figure. It rose slowly, impossibly tall, covered in earth and roots, with faces faintly visible across its surface. It exhaled. A sound like wind and whispers at once. "You have come too far," it seemed to say, though no lips moved. "The dead is owed. The roots remember." Claire fired her flashlight directly at it, shaking. The thing recoiled slightly, then advanced, dragging soil and stones beneath its weight. Panic-stricken, she ran. Branches clawed at her face, roots wrapped around her boots, slowing her, pulling her toward the pit. She heard the faint screams of the missing children beneath the surface, calling her name, begging her not to leave. She reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the road. The town lay before her, empty, but the ground under her hands was still pulsing. She could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath Brindle Hollow, patient, waiting, hungrier than ever. The next day, search teams found Claire unconscious near the forest, hands deep in the mud, eyes wide in terror. She could not speak of what she had seen. When questioned, all she could manage was a single, repeated phrase, it always takes." By autumn, the town had begun to crumble physically as well as psychologically. Buildings shifted slightly, foundations cracked, and wells ran dry. The few remaining residents avoided the forest entirely, and those who lived near the river moved away in droves. The Harlan property remained fenced and untouched, a monument to the thing beneath. Sometimes at night, lights flickered through the trees, and the faint hum returned, carrying voices that were human, and yet not. Some swear they could hear the rhythm of drums in the soil, a heartbeat not their own, echoing in every home, every street, every hollowed heart in the town. Brindle Hollow had become a ghost of itself, but it was alive, in the worst way. And somewhere, beneath the roads and river and houses, the roots waited. Patient, infinite, and hungry. Because the earth remembers. Because the debt is never fully paid. By late autumn, Brindle Hollow had transformed into a town haunted not only by what had vanished but by what lingered. The wind no longer carried leaves or the chatter of birds. Instead, it carried voices, soft, distorted, whispering indistinctly through the bare branches of trees, through the cracks in walls, through the empty streets. People said they heard their names called, urgent and pleading, sometimes from the very air around them. Those who tried to follow the sounds found nothing but frost-covered ground, and yet the voices persisted. Residents who had remained began reporting new phenomena. Glass rattled on shelves without reason. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Doors opened and closed as though guided by unseen hands. The hum from the soil beneath the town had grown constant, vibrating through every structure, every floorboard, like the heartbeat of something enormous lying just beneath. Some claimed they saw fleeting figures at the periphery of their vision, children or adults moving too quickly, always vanishing when looked at directly. Deputy Claire Rowe returned to Brindle Hollow, compelled by the recurring disturbances. She had been absent for weeks, recovering from the trauma of her encounter with the roots, yet even in her absence, reports had piled up in her office, livestock mutilated in precise patterns, strange efflorescence on walls, soil displaced in impossible ways, and, most alarmingly, more disappearances. Every case led back to the area surrounding the old Harlan property. Claire spent nights mapping the disturbances, creating patterns and overlays, trying to find logic where none seemed to exist. She noticed the whispers in the wind always seemed to originate along specific lines through the town, connecting the church, the mill, the river, and the Harlan woods. It was as though the town itself had become a vessel for something deep, ancient, and aware. One night, she positioned herself at the center of the supposed pattern, in the remnants of the town square. The wind picked up unexpectedly, cold and sharp. She closed her eyes and listened. At first, it was indistinct, the murmur of leaves and branches. Then it grew clearer, deliberate. Words she could not fully understand, but tones that carried command and accusation. The voices were layered, some youthful, some old, some familiar, some alien. The entire town seemed to breathe in unison, carried on the wind. Claire noticed the soil beneath her feet shifting slightly, forming subtle ridges as though something moved just below. She knelt, pressing her palms against the earth. A vibration traveled up her arms, into her chest, synchronized with the voices above. Then, faintly, she recognized the rhythm, the same pattern she had seen during the pit incident at the Harlan property. The roots were awake, moving beneath the town, communicating, coordinating. The voices began to coalesce, repeating the same sequence. Claire caught fragments. Bring it back, it remembers, the debt. Her stomach tightened as a cold realization settled over her, whatever was beneath Brindle Hollow was not dormant. It had begun interacting with the surface, sending signals, summoning, shaping events according to its will. Then came the first direct manifestation. A gust of wind ripped through the square, strong enough to knock Claire off her feet. Debris swirled, and she saw it, fleeting figures in the wind. Faces she recognized from missing person reports, their expressions vacant, mouths moving as though they tried to communicate something urgent. They swirled and merged with the dust and leaves, vanishing moments later. The whispers intensified, louder, almost intelligible, and the soil beneath vibrated violently, as if the town itself were breathing in anticipation. Claire retreated to the remaining structures, seeking refuge, but the phenomena followed. Windows rattled, floors shook, and walls groaned as the wind carried the voices indoors. Even in the church, the sanctuary of Brindle Hollow, the whispers invaded, layering over the echo of prayers and hymns. The altar trembled slightly, as if responding to the same rhythm that had once pulsed beneath the Harlan pit. By dawn, several townsfolk reported the soil around their homes heaving slightly, leaving patterns in the earth, circles, lines, intersecting shapes. None could explain how or why. Most were too afraid to leave their homes during daylight. Only Claire moved with purpose, documenting, recording, plotting. She began suspecting that the wind carried the influence of the roots, a medium by which whatever slept beneath communicated with the surface. Her suspicions were confirmed when she visited the remains of the Harlan property. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. The fence no longer looked like a boundary, but a perimeter, a containment measure. She approached the forest cautiously, feeling the ground vibrate under each step. At the edge, she knelt and listened, letting the wind carry the sounds into her ears. There, she clearly heard her own name, called repeatedly in a soft, pleading tone. But there was something else, another rhythm, low, deliberate, synchronized with the heartbeat in the soil. A pulse that commanded attention, demanded presence, and made her feel uncomfortably small. Claire realized, with growing horror, that Brindle Hollow was alive in a way the townspeople could not comprehend. The whispers in the wind were not random. They were instructions, warnings, invitations, all emanating from something beneath the earth that had been bound, fed, and now, without the Harlans, was beginning to assert its will. The final confirmation came the following night. Claire returned to the town square just as the wind rose. The whispers coalesced into a singular phrase, repeated in multiple voices: it remembers, it takes, it awakens. The ground beneath her feet shifted violently. Pavement cracked. Roots burst from the soil, intertwining with the debris, forming shapes that resembled human limbs. The wind carried fragments of voices she had never heard before: children, elders, even animals. And at the center of it all, a single pulse emanated, growing louder, stronger, as though the earth itself were asserting dominance. Claire ran, recording everything with a portable camera. Her footage captured the wind twisting violently, leaves swirling into impossible patterns, soil rising in small columns, and shadows moving unnaturally across the town. She barely escaped the epicenter, and when she looked back, the entire square seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though the town itself were inhaling. By morning, Brindle Hollow lay quiet again, deceptively calm. But everyone who remained could feel the difference. The whispers in the wind were no longer occasional. They were constant, layered over every sound, every movement. They spoke in fragments, urging, warning, reminding, a persistent reminder that the earth beneath Brindle Hollow was no longer passive. It had a voice. And with that voice came the realization: the town had never been safe. It had only been contained. By the time October rolled in, Brindle Hollow was no longer a town of living inhabitants. It had become a stage for something far older, far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The streets were lined with abandoned houses, their windows shattered, doors hanging on rusted hinges. A thick fog lingered, rolling off the river in slow waves, carrying with it the faint, persistent whispers that now haunted every corner. The town itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the hum that came from beneath the soil, slow, deliberate, unyielding. Deputy Claire Rowe, determined to understand the escalating phenomena, returned once again to the heart of the town. She carried maps, recording devices, and the notes she had pieced together over months of investigation. Each visit brought new horrors: soil heaving unexpectedly, floors trembling, doors opening of their own accord. Every single anomaly traced back to the Harlan property or the roots that extended outward like a vast, subterranean network beneath the entire town. Claire knew she had to confront what lay beneath. She organized a descent into the forest near the Harlan home, guided by the faint vibration in the earth. The soil beneath her boots pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat, growing stronger as she neared the center. Leaves rustled in unnatural patterns, and the fog thickened, wrapping around her in cold tendrils. She could hear the whispers clearly now, fragmented but urgent, urging her forward: see, understand, awaken. At the base of an ancient oak, roots twisted unnaturally, forming a natural gateway into the earth. Claire knelt and brushed away dirt and debris, revealing a narrow opening. The smell of earth and decay was overwhelming, pungent and metallic. She squeezed inside, flashlight in hand, and began her descent. The tunnel walls were slick with moisture and lined with thick, intertwining roots that seemed almost alive. Each step deeper caused the soil to tremble, and the whispers grew louder, echoing from every angle. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, larger than any structure above ground. Roots hung from the ceiling like stalactites, their tips pulsing faintly. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of soft, dark soil that shifted with the slightest pressure. At the center of the cavern was a massive tree, its trunk impossibly wide, roots sprawling across the entire floor. Symbols etched into the bark glowed faintly, the same circles and lines Claire had encountered elsewhere in Brindle Hollow. And at the base of the tree, she saw them, dozens of human figures, partially merged with the soil, suspended as if caught between life and death. Their expressions were vacant, their bodies contorted, but their eyes, hollow and pale, followed her every movement. Claire swallowed hard, realizing that these were the missing townspeople, and possibly more from decades past. They were bound to the roots, feeding some ancient, inexorable cycle. The hum intensified as Claire stepped closer. She could feel a vibration through her legs, into her chest. The roots pulsed in response to her presence, as if the cavern itself was aware of her intrusion. Then, a figure detached itself from the mass of roots, not fully human, not fully plant, but something in between. Its limbs elongated and twisted, faces faintly visible along its bark-like skin. It moved silently toward her, carrying the weight of centuries. Claire raised her flashlight, but the beam seemed to bend around the figure. She spoke, her voice trembling, trying to reason, "I need to understand. I want to help." The thing exhaled a sound that reverberated through the cavern, a low, guttural vibration that penetrated her very bones. The whispers converged, repeating a single message over and over. "It remembers. The roots remember. The debt must continue." Suddenly, the cavern shifted. The ground heaved violently, and the roots writhed like serpents. Claire stumbled, catching herself on a protruding root. She realized the tree, the roots, and the figures bound to them were not static. They were part of a single organism, one conscious, patient, and ancient. Then came a revelation: the missing, the disappearances, even the Harlan family themselves, they were part of a long chain of sacrifices and rituals meant to feed and contain this force. Without the Harlan lineage, the containment had weakened, allowing the organism beneath Brindle Hollow to grow bolder, reaching upward into the town, manifesting in whispers, tremors, and disappearances. Claire took a cautious step forward. Her recorder captured the hum, now synchronized with the throbbing rhythm in her chest. She felt an almost magnetic pull, drawing her toward the base of the massive tree. The soil beneath her boots shifted, forming intricate patterns, circles, lines, and symbols echoing those she had seen throughout the town. The roots themselves seemed to pulse with life, beckoning her closer, demanding attention, demanding participation in a cycle she was only beginning to comprehend. Suddenly, a voice, clear, singular, human, emerged from the mass: "The debt is ours. We serve the roots. You must see the truth." It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Claire realized it was Margaret Dean, the librarian who had vanished months earlier. She was alive in some sense, bound to the roots, an intermediary between the organism and the world above. The realization struck Claire cold: the organism beneath Brindle Hollow was not merely feeding. It was learning, adapting, and using those it bound to communicate, to enforce, to perpetuate its influence above ground. Every tremor, every whisper, every disappearance was a deliberate act, a message encoded in the soil, the air, and the people themselves. Claire's instincts screamed to flee, but her curiosity, her compulsion, overrode fear. She knew she had to document everything, for the town, for the missing, for the world. She recorded images, symbols, and sounds, capturing every pulse of the roots, every whisper carried on the wind. Each recording resonated with a low-frequency vibration, almost imperceptible, that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. As she worked, the tree shifted subtly, roots curling toward her, enveloping her in a gentle, yet insistent grip. Claire understood that the organism did not intend immediate harm. It sought connection, understanding, perhaps even compliance. Its influence was both protective and predatory, an ancient force maintaining balance in a way humans could not comprehend. Hours passed, though it felt like days. When Claire finally backed toward the tunnel entrance, she noticed a pattern forming in the soil beneath her, symbols, arcs, and intersecting lines that seemed to map the entire town above. Every house, every road, every landmark aligned perfectly with the roots, suggesting that Brindle Hollow itself was an instrument of containment. Claire realized then that leaving the cavern was only the beginning. She had to warn the town, document the cycle, and somehow find a way to maintain the balance the Harlan family had enforced for generations. Failure to do so would allow the roots to extend further, consuming not only Brindle Hollow but everything nearby, integrating life into its subterranean web. As she crawled back into the night, the forest seemed to hum in acknowledgement. The whispers had softened, the tremors lessened, but Claire could feel the pulse still resonating through her bones. Brindle Hollow waited, patient and eternal, its roots beneath the surface alive and aware, shaping the destiny of everyone who walked above them. Winter had returned to Brindle Hollow, but it carried no comfort. The fog lay heavy, curling through the empty streets and clinging to the skeletal trees like frozen fingers. The town was nearly deserted, but those who remained knew the truth. The Harlan property and the surrounding woods were alive in a way that could not be escaped. The soil pulsed beneath their feet, and the whispers in the wind carried warnings, instructions, and pleas from those bound beneath the roots. Deputy Claire Rowe had returned once more, determined to confront the heart of the phenomenon. She carried recordings, maps, and a small collection of ritual artifacts recovered from her earlier investigations. She knew the organism beneath Brindle Hollow was not just feeding, it was reorganizing itself, reclaiming the circle that had been disrupted by the disappearance of the Harlans. Every tremor, every whispered name, every subtle shift in the landscape was part of its plan to restore the balance it had always maintained. Claire approached the Harlan property at dusk. The fog swirled unnaturally, almost forming shapes that reached toward her as she walked. The fence, rusted and broken, seemed to vibrate, pulsing in rhythm with the subterranean heartbeat. She could feel the pull of the roots beneath the soil, tugging subtly at her boots, urging her forward. The air was thick, metallic, and cold, carrying the faint hum that now seemed omnipresent, flowing through every stone, every branch, every breath. Inside the remnants of the Harlan home, Claire felt the weight of centuries pressing down. The floorboards creaked under her feet, though no one had walked here in months. The walls bore faint etchings, circles, lines, intersecting symbols, all glowing faintly in the low light. It was a map of the town, the roots, and the boundaries of the circle. The Harlan family had not merely lived here, they had maintained a ritualized network of containment, ensuring that the organism beneath remained bounded. She descended into the basement, flashlight trembling in her grip. The air was damp and pungent, thick with the scent of soil, decay, and something older, metallic and sweet. The stone slab that had once concealed the pit now lay partially exposed, its edges chipped, revealing the circular cavity beneath. The hum grew louder, resonating through the flashlight, the floor, and her chest. At the center of the pit, the roots had begun to rise, intertwining and coiling, forming shapes that were both intricate and grotesque. Figures moved within the roots, partially human, partially plant, suspended in a state of perpetual containment. Their eyes, pale and vacant, followed Claire as she stepped closer. These were the missing, townspeople from recent months, and perhaps from decades past, bound to the organism in a cycle that was both protective and predatory. Claire understood then that the circle could not be destroyed, only reclaimed. The Harlan family had performed the ritual not to destroy the entity, but to maintain a fragile equilibrium. Without their bloodline and careful attention, the circle had weakened, allowing the roots to extend, infiltrate, and manifest in ways that threatened the town above. The whispers, tremors, disappearances, and the pulsing of the earth were all consequences of that disruption. Determined to restore the balance, Claire began carefully tracing the symbols etched in the walls and floor, comparing them with her recordings of the root patterns above ground. The alignment was precise, every line, every circle, every intersecting point corresponded to a physical landmark in the town. Roads, buildings, waterways, all part of an intricate containment system. Her plan was dangerous, but necessary. She would perform the ritual as the Harlan family had, temporarily binding the organism and restoring equilibrium until someone else could continue the cycle. The task required precision. Claire used the recordings to chant along with the rhythm of the roots, tracing symbols in the soil and aligning objects according to the maps she had painstakingly assembled. The air thickened, the fog swirled, and the hum intensified, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. The figures bound in the roots stirred slightly, their movements coordinated, as if acknowledging her presence and participation. Hours passed, though time seemed distorted within the basement. Claire felt the weight of generations pressing down, the immense patience of the roots, the cumulative will of the organism that had waited centuries for balance to be restored. She continued, voice low, movements deliberate, tracing every circle, aligning every line, and marking the intersection points with careful precision. The air vibrated with energy, a resonance she could feel deep in her chest and bones. Then came the shift. The roots recoiled slightly, releasing the figures suspended within them. One by one, they descended gently to the soil of the cavern floor, unharmed but pale and exhausted. The hum lessened, replaced by a subtle warmth, a gentle pulse that suggested stability. Claire realized she had successfully restored the circle, at least temporarily.